Today, Bitcoin went up to 13,500 something, and people are following in left and right. I'm doing laundry, reading the book, The Meteor Hunt. We're reading chapter 1. This is episode 2. So we came up to the part that Stanford meets the person he was waiting for. Stanford obviously knew the woman. He put on his best poker face, did not say a word, didn't move a muscle. After turning his horse, he calmly headed over and waited in front of Judge Pratt's home. The local curiosity seekers were on pins and needles again. This time they inched closer, but the stranger did not know they existed. In a few seconds, the woman had reached the square, white with foam. Her steed pulled up a few steps from Judge's front door. The stranger doffed his hat and said, "Good morning, Miss Walker." "And good morning to you too, Mr. Stanford," Arcadia Walker answered, nodding graciously. And believe you me, the eyes of Waston were glued on the two newcomers, and the onlookers spoke among themselves. If they've come with a case for Judge Pratt, he'll work it out so they both win. Yes, sir. Or he isn't the sharp fellow we think he is. And if the two of them are single, the best deal would be to have them get married. So their tongues wagged back and forth, but Mr. Stanford and Miss Walker evidently couldn't have cared less. Stanford was about to climb off his horse and knock on Judge's front door, but just then it opened on its own. Mr. Pratt reappeared, and this time his old housekeeper Kate stood right behind him. In front of the house, the horses had been pawing the ground so noisily. The judge had left his garden and the housekeeper her kitchen to come out and see what was going on. Staying in the saddle, Stanford spoke to the magistrate. "You're the justice of the peace?" he asked. "That's right. I am Seth Stanford from Boston, Massachusetts." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Stanford." "And this is Miss Arcadia Walker from Trenton, New Jersey." "It's a great honor, Miss Walker." After looking the man over, Pratt shifted his attention to the woman. Miss Arcadia Walker was a delightful young lady, 24 years old, light blue eyes, dark brown hair, smooth complexion barely affected by the open air, teeth flawlessly white and even, taller than average, ravishing figure, appearing exceptionally lithe, agile, and elegant. In her riding dogs, she was completely at ease on her horse, which kept prancing around in reaction to Seth Stanford's steed. She held the reins in stylishly gloved fingers, and any expert would have spotted her for a top-notch rider. Everything about her had that certain something characteristic of the upper classes in the United States. The American aristocracy, you might say, if such a description didn't conflict with the democratic values of folks in the New World. Miss Arcadia Walker hailed from New Jersey, had only distant relatives, made up her own mind, had her own money, boasted an adventurous nature typical of young Americans, did whatever she pleased, had already spent several years abroad in the European hotspots, and was up on the latest trends in Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. And thanks to what she's seen and heard during her ongoing travels, she could talk to French, British, German, and Italians in their own lingo. She was cluttered. She was a cultured young woman whose education, thanks to her late tutor, had been exceptionally thorough. She'd even developed a good head for business, and she handled her money with unusual shrewdness. Most of what we've said of Miss Arcadia Walker can also be said symmetrically, that's the exact word, of Mr. Sid Stamford. Likewise independent, rich, fond of traveling, going everywhere, he spent little time in his hometown of Boston. In the winter he visited Europe's leading cities, where he repeatedly ran into a fellow American, the adventurous Miss Walker. In the summer he came back to the land of his birth, to those seaside resorts where he could mingle with upper-class Yankees. There he would bump into Miss Walker again. Common interests soon brought those two dashing young people together, so the gossips, and that includes the ones in Constitution Square, decided they were perfect for each other. Both were keen on traveling and would chase off to any place where political or military developments made the news. So not surprisingly, the notion came to Mr. Stamford and Miss Walker to join forces, since they wouldn't have to change their habits in any way. Figuratively speaking, they would no longer be two ships convoying side by side, but a single top-quality vessel so well-rigged and so seaworthy could sail any ocean on earth. So it wasn't some thorny legal dispute that had brought Mr. Sid Stamford and Miss Arcadia Walker before the Justice of the Peace in this town. No, after handling all legal formalities before the proper authorities in Massachusetts and New Jersey, it made an appointment in Boston for today, March 27, at 10:07, to take what Weiser had said is the most important step in a person's life. Mr. Stamford and Miss Walker having been introduced to the judge as you've seen. Potter's next move was to ask his two visitors what they needed from him. "I want to marry Miss Arcadia Walker," the man answered. "And I want to marry Mr. Seth Stamford," the woman added. The magistrate bowed to the couple and said, "Mr. Stamford, Miss Walker, I'm at your service." They bowed back. "And when would you like me to schedule a ceremony?" Judge Proths continued. "Right now, if you're available," Stamford stated. "Because as soon as I'm Mrs. Stamford, we'll be leaving town," Miss Walker said. Proth's face expressed how sorry he was, and all Boston too, that their community couldn't get better acquainted with this delightful couple currently honoring the town with their presence. Then he added, "I'm completely at your disposal." And he stepped back to welcome them inside. But then Stamford said, "Do Miss Walker and I have to dismount?" "Not at all," Proths stated. "It's just as simple to marry you on horseback as on the ground." It would be hard to find a more easygoing magistrate, even in the eccentric country of America. "One question," Judge Proth continued. "Have you dealt with all legal formalities?" "We have," Stamford answered. and he produced 2 marriage licenses duly made out by court clerks in Boston and Trenton after payment of the required fees. Pratt took the paperwork, put on his gold-rimmed Prince lens glasses, and carefully scanned the documents, which had been properly endorsed and stamped. Then he said, "Everything is in order. I can now give you a marriage certificate." Not surprisingly, the local busybodies had increased in number and were crowding around the couple, eager to witness this high-class wedding whose circumstances would have been outlandish anywhere else on the planet. Yet the 2 participants weren't just unconcerned, they were unaware. From his doorsteps, Judge Pratt spoke in a voice everybody could hear. "Do you," said Stanford, "take Arcadia Walker to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "And do you, Arcadia Walker, take," said Stanford, "to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." The magistrate drew back for a second or two, as poised and intent as a photographer waiting for the right instant to snap a picture. Then he proceeded. "Said Stanford of Boston and Arcadia Walker of Trenton, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife." The 2 newlyweds drew closer and held hands. He sealed their union. Then Stanford took a $500 bill out of his wallet and handed it over, saying, "For your services." And the new Mrs. Stanford held out another such bill, saying, "For charity." They both nodded to the judge. He bowed back. Then they flicked their reins and rode quickly off in the direction of Wilcox. "And like the philosophical fellow he is, John Pratt said to himself, America is such an amazing place. It's almost as easy to get married as to get divorced." Chapter 2, which welcomes the reader into the home of Mr. Dean Forsyth, whose household includes his nephew Francis Gordon and his housekeeper Mrs. Mitz. "Mrs. Mitz, Mrs. Mitz." "Yes, Mr. Francis." What's going on with Uncle Dean?" "I ain't sure, Mr. Francis." "Think he's sick?" "Not that I know of. But if he keeps this up, he's gonna be." These questions and answers flew back and forth between the young fellow of 23 and an old lady of 65, both in the dining room of a home on Elizabeth Street, on this same town of Boston that had just witnessed an exceptionally eccentric American-style wedding. His house on Elizabeth Street was the property of Mr. Dean Forsyth, who was 55 years old and looked it. Big, shabby head, beady eyes behind thick lensed glasses, stooping shoulders, heavy neck always encircled by a double-layered necktie that climbed to his chin, rumpled baggy frock coat, loose vest with the bottom buttons always undone, pants too short and barely coming down to his coat hoppers, fez perched on the rear part of his grizzled head, face lined with 1,000 wrinkles and tipped with your standard North American goatee. This was the man whom his nephew Francis Gordon and his housekeeper Mrs. Mitz were discussing on the afternoon of April 3rd. Losing both parents at an early age, Francis had been raised by Dean Forsyth, his uncle on his mother's side. Though he had a bequest coming to him from his uncle, Francis wanted to make his own way in the world, and Forsyth had agreed. So the young Gordon had enrolled in a humanities program at the renowned Institute of Harvard. He had graduated a lawyer and opened a practice in Boston, where he'd become the staunch defender of widows, orphans, and homesteads. He knew his case law backwards and forwards, and he had an easy, eloquent courtroom manner. Young and old, his colleagues respected him to a man, and he didn't have any enemies in the world. He was a good-looking fella, with handsome brown hair and dark eyes, well-shaped hands, humor without sarcasm, natural friendliness, and skill at the various sports popular with Yankee gentlemen. And since he was one of the town's most legible young men, had fallen appropriately in love with delightful Jenny Huddleston, the daughter of Dr. Huddleston and his wife Flora. Flora appears to have a surname as Clarish. But at this juncture, we aren't quite ready for young Miss Jenny. It isn't time for her to take the stage, and we'll be better off meeting her in her own family surroundings. It won't be long now, but you can't be too careful in telling this kind of tale. Getting back to Francis Gordon, we'll add that he lived in the house on Elizabeth Street and most likely wouldn't be moving out till he and Jenny Huddleston got married. But once again, we'll hold off on Miss Jenny and concentrate instead on the old housekeeper, Mrs. Mitz, bosom buddy of her employer's nephew, whom she loved like a son, or grandson rather, since grandmas are usually most doting elders of all. Mrs. Mitz was your model housekeeper, a member of a member of a dying breed, the descendant of an extinct species of servant that's as loyal as a dog and as housebound as a cat. As you might imagine, Miss Mitz didn't mince words with Mr. Forsyth, and when he was in the wrong, she let him know it. If he disagreed, he had only one option: head for his study and bolt the door. In any case, Forsyth didn't mind being off by himself. He could depend on another person of some note, an individual who also hid from scolding, lecturing tongue of Mrs. Mitz. This was a little fellow nicknamed Omicron, whose moniker might well have been Omega if he hadn't been such a pipsqueak. You should understand that I'm reading this book for the first time in English after several years, and some words just don't come easy to me. So Omicron hadn't grown a notch since he was 15, at which point he'd stood only 4 feet 6 inches high. His real name was Tom Whiff, and he'd been a hired hand in the Forsyth home right from the time he'd stopped growing. Since he was now over 50, this means he'd been working for Francis' uncle for some 35 years. But it's important to understand how Omicron's role had changed over time. He evolved into Forsyth's assistant, helping him in his work with an intensity that easily matched his employer's. Okay, This is good for now. Bye bye.